Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I'm Dr. Anthony Gustin, and it's my job to get to the bottom of a ketogenic diet so you have the answers you need to make keto work for you. This week, joining me is Ryan Lowery. Ryan is one of the leading researchers in the world of the ketogenic diet. Him and his team in Tampa at the ASPI are doing some really incredible things. His recently published tome, The Ketogenic Bible, is an incredible evidence-based reference text on anything you'd ever want to know about a ketogenic diet. In this episode, we chat about everything. Ryan works with tons of pro athletes. He talks about how he uses a ketogenic diet to make them perform even better. We talk about some of his unreleased data from his research and everything in between. I always learn so much when I talk to this guy, so hopefully you'll pick out some things that you can learn too. So that being said, let's get into the show. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and the best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. Ryan, thanks for being on the show here.
Hey man, thanks. It's an honor to be on.
So we are here in sunny San Diego.
Beautiful here, man.
The Low Carb USA conference, sitting by the pool, hanging out. So I had to grab you. I saw you hanging out all weekend, just getting mobbed by people. Which is kind of cool that you are rapidly growing in this kind of keto low carb sphere as a kind of an influencer and somebody who's putting all this stuff, which is awesome because you are genuinely helping a lot of people and like really using things like social media as this education tool, which is awesome.
Thanks, man.
Where did all this start? Like, how did you get into this and like have such a drive to help people? It comes across as like so authentic. It's awesome.
Oh, thanks, man. You know, kind of my entire life, I grew up very close family relationships, and a lot of problems with like my family's health. And I think that's where it all stemmed from. Is my mom has Crohn's, my aunt has MS, and just a lot of auto-inflammatory diseases has just been all across my family. So I've always tried to figure out how can I help them, and then how can I then help my friends and a lot of other people. And so all throughout my life, I've studied science, and really nutrition was my main focus. Exercise is great, but I really wanted to focus on nutrition because everyone has to eat.
Yeah.
And so we kind of got introduced to this low carb ketogenic conversation by Dr. Volek, who's here. When we heard him speak about all of this incredible information on ketogenic diets, and he's working with endurance athletes. And we kind of were like, hey, well, what's the data on resistance trained athletes? Like, you know, it's great. There's a ton of data for epilepsy, and Dr. Dom is doing a ton of incredible work with cancer, but no one's really doing it with people who are exercising in like resistance training. And so for us, we looked at that and went, wow, there's a real opportunity. No one's looking at this. And that kind of just led down this rabbit hole of looking at ketogenic dieting and resistance training to everything. Now we're looking at studies with ketogenic dieting, exogenous ketones, and like longevity and how that has an impact. So it's just been a incredible journey, and it's something we're really passionate about.
Right. So you said that your family had a lot of health problems when you were growing up. Did you have anything that you were trying to overcome personally with that?
Yeah, you know, a lot of it for me, it was weird because I was always really active. And the biggest problem for me is I could never put on weight, and I ate horribly growing it. Literally, like would go to McDonald's and Wendy's and would eat terrible, and no matter what I ate, couldn't put on weight. And the rest of my family would do the complete opposite. They would put on weight very easily. But soon after I stopped playing sports in college, I soon realized that my metabolism wasn't the same.
Right.
And soon it was like, okay, going to go get some fast food wasn't the same as when I was 14. And all of a sudden the pounds started adding up fairly quickly. And I was like, wow, I need to really understand how to eat better.
Right. So is that when you kind of had this epiphany about nutrition, or did you have that earlier on?
Yeah, that's when I really started to take a focus and go, wow, okay, well maybe my body can't tolerate 20-piece nugget and large fry anymore like it used to. And so how do I felt horrible cognitively. I couldn't think right. And I was like, I really need to turn this around and figure out a way that I can eat better, perform better. Even though I'm not an athlete, I need to perform in school and work and things like that.
So did you go into undergrad kind of with the perspective of kind of changing performance and health from kind of just a broad spectrum, or did you have any specificity going into undergrad? And then kind of what was that experience like?
Yeah, so going into undergrad, I really thought I was going to dive down the physical therapy route. I went to school originally for physical therapy, interned for a semester at a physical therapy clinic, and soon realized that it wasn't the route I wanted to go. And I met Dr. Jacob Wilson very early on, and he kind of introduced me to this world of nutrition, exercise, and the combination of two to really create something very unique. And so I started really studying intimately at that point of like, okay, if I'm going to be playing sports throughout college, I need to eat better. I need to actually train better. And how do I do that all encompassing into one?
Right. So what made you not want to do PT, physical therapy? Anything specifically?
I think it was the where I interned at, I just walked in and every single day it was the same people coming in, and a lot of the people and the patients they were working with a lot of them were just coming there going through the motions. And I realized I'm like, these people don't really want this help. It's tough to work with someone when it's like they're not even interested in getting better themselves. And I'm like, how do we, rather than be working with them after the fact, how do we be proactive in it and potentially work with them on exercising better so that they don't have an injury, or eating better so that they aren't overweight and have other complications. I was like, how do we be on the forefront of that rather than being reactive to the problem?
Interesting. And so was that kind of what led to the kick-ass facility you guys have now in Florida?
Yeah, that was always the dream is we were formerly in academics and did a lot there and did a ton of research. And very early on, we realized that in that world, there's 4 walls and a ceiling, and it's like, well, there's only so much you can do. And so our goal was, how do we get this message out to the world? And with that, we built the Applied Science and Performance Institute. It was a vision we had for a very long time. And by doing that, we wanted to educate the masses. And by taking complex information, stuff that only scientists would talk about in this other language that they tend to communicate in, how do we take that scientific information, break it down, make it understandable, digestible for everyone?
Right. And so what kind of is the basis of the ASPI?
Yeah, so our mission is to change lives through science and innovation. And so what we do there is research along with elite training. So we work with some of the most elite professionals in the world, but taking a very scientific approach. And then on top of that, doing research on everything from not only the elite athletes, but anti-aging, people with Parkinsons, Alzheimer's, anything you can imagine, of really just trying to take the latest science and try and come up with solutions and then find those solutions and educate people on them.
Right. That's actually a much better version of how I approached my clinics when I first got out of school. So I had the same intention. So I worked specifically with elite level athletes, just like how NASCAR, you develop vehicles that then go and they take that technology to the mass markets. Same type of thing that I wanted to do with movement when I first got out of school. But you guys are doing it, I think, in a much higher feedback driven rate. So good work with that. Yeah.
Thanks, man.
So where did ketosis, low carb, come in here when you guys had that facility? Was it something that was in mind when you were building it out, or was it more so a performance first, nutrition and ketosis second? And kind of how has that evolved?
Yeah, so we've been into the ketogenic diet and ketosis before we built ASPI, but that was definitely always on the mind. It's just so many emerging areas for potential applications of the ketogenic diet. And so we were like, how do we not only lock ourselves into this, high performance aspect, but performance is more than just seeing our favorite players play on Sunday.
Right.
It's the grandmother who wants to stay around longer to see her grandchildren, or the father who wants to be able to run outside and play with his kids. Like, that's performance. And so how do we take what we know from elite athletes and then transfer it throughout the entire world?
Interesting. And so how is that looking kind of on a day-to-day basis for you guys?
Yeah, it's busy. It depends on the time of year. It's a lot of times we'll have NFL athletes, NHL athletes, MLB athletes, all in the facility training, but at the same time, we always are constantly doing research, is whether it's animal research or human research, we're always trying to find, okay, what's new, what's innovative, and how can we kind of bridge the gap between the science and the innovation and allow people to take what we're finding every single day in the lab and understand it rather than talk over their heads or talk in these complex terms. How can we take that finding and make sure that someone can then take it and apply it themselves?
Okay. So are you focusing more on a ketogenic diet and nutrition or more on performance, or kind of just always a hybrid of the two things?
Yeah, a lot of hybrid, kind of personalized to what the athlete or the individual needs. A lot of our athletes aren't necessarily on a ketogenic diet, but a lot of the research we do centers around ketogenic diets, and we're educating more and more on that. And a real big focus of ours right now, which there's a recent article on it with traumatic brain injury, is really targeting a lot of the NFL guys. And they come in and it's like, all right, well, what do you guys think about the next 20 years of your life? Like, how can we provide some benefit, some neuroprotective benefits, and looking at how you eat rather than going out and eating fast food all the time, because professional athletes have the worst diets out of anyone.
I'm well aware of this. It shocked me when I first started working with these guys and figuring out what they were consuming.
Oh, it's horrible.
Yeah,
it's insane. So how do you take someone at that level who's performing well and say, hey, if you eat differently and you kind of have this alternative way of eating, not only might you perform better, but think about your life after the game. So it's trying to get their head to wrap around that concept. So that's been a big focus of ours right now.
Right. So what type of research are you doing right now? Anything specific that you can share?
Right now, we're finishing up a longevity study, which is fascinating. We took animals and literally fed them either a ketogenic diet or a standard American diet for their entire lives. We just got those results back, and I mean, it's no surprise to us, but like the animals that were on a ketogenic diet lived significantly longer. So right now we have a ton of tissue to analyze. And then on top of that, the traumatic brain injury stuff. We're really starting to get a lot of the NFL athletes in, and we're bringing them in not only looking at a ketogenic diet, but how can exogenous ketones play a role in potentially recovering some of those problems that they had very early on.
Interesting about the animal study. What have you guys seen? I know you obviously probably have a lot of data to pour through, but is there any kind of large overarching mechanisms that you kind of found were from the ketogenic diet leading to these longevity increases?
Yeah. So not only did their body composition was drastically different. I mean, when these animals are done, you cut them open and you look at their organs. The ones that were on a ketogenic diet, it literally looked like something out of a textbook. There was no real fat around the organs. It was
interesting.
It was incredible. But the ones that were on a standard American diet, it was like sad to see how much fat, some visceral fat that people normally wouldn't even see, but it's all surrounding the organs, and I think that was playing a large part in that.
How would you explain ketosis before we get too crazy here? Because I feel like we're going to dive off a cliff pretty soon, but how would you explain ketosis if you could only do it in like a tweet?
You know, the way we define like ketosis or a ketogenic diet is minimizing glucogenic substrates. And what we mean by glucogenic substrates is either carbohydrates or some protein can convert over. Minimizing glucogenic substrates so that your body relies on primarily using fat and ketones as fuel.
It's a long tweet.
I think it's under the 200 characters. Yeah. I think that makes it.
Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting so obviously we see the fat accumulation and how that affects stuff. So visceral fat is obviously linked to a lot of different pathologies, but are there any other markers that you guys were looking at, or was it just lifespan and age span, and what else kind of was the primary focus of that?
Yeah, so tons of different tissue analysis looking at what genes are upregulated, what things are activated versus not. I mean, we know that ketones themselves are HDAC inhibitors and can have profound effects on signaling. So what does that signaling do when you literally feed someone that their entire lives? So we're trying to uncover some of that.
Okay, so with people who aren't familiar with HDAC inhibition and kind of histone modulation, what Can you explain kind of what that is and what that means?
Yeah. So as we age, there's these things called histones that, the way I like to explain it, it's kind of like a wheel. And over time, these histones come and attach themselves to the wheel, and it slows it down. And that wheel is part of like our mitochondrial function. And our mitochondria is the powerhouse of what really powers our cells and everything that's going on in the body. Well, when that comes along and these histones attach themselves and wrap themselves around our DNA can't express itself like it could when we were younger. And so imagine now these wheels stop turning and they're getting wrapped around, and they can't really express the genes that they used to. Well, over time, that's what potentially leads to aging. And so if ketones can kind of come in like a bouncer at a bar and prevent those histones, say, nope, deflect them out and send them away, that DNA can still express itself over time and potentially lead to longer longevity.
Yeah. And what I've noticed too is with the popularity of the keto diet going crazy right now, that there's this huge split between these crowds of people who think that the only way to do it is by eating full nutritional ketosis, so just eating a very high-fat diet and getting the benefits that way. And then there's also a camp that is using products like exogenous ketones. And so I think I've seen some stuff that actually show that you still get this HDAC inhibition using exogenous ketones, even in the presence of carbohydrates. And so this is what's interesting to me about what you were saying about the NFL as well, in brain trauma. So we also know the effect that ketones have on the brain is very positive. And so are you looking at these people with eating kind of a normal higher carbohydrate diet to fuel performance, plus taking exogenous ketones to kind of mitigate the effect from kind of CTE type pathologies? Or how are you looking at it like that?
Yeah, exactly right. And I think one of the things that we know about traumatic brain injury is if you look at someone's brain who has traumatic brain injury or CTE, and you compare it to someone who has Alzheimer's, they look very similar. Very similar. And so immediately after these games and over time, as it starts to accumulate all these plaques and tau proteins start to accumulate in their brain becomes resistant to utilizing glucose. And so we see that over and over and over again. And yet what do? They go to the sideline, they chug down some sugar-filled beverage. And it's like, is that really doing them any good, or is it actually doing them more harm? And so one of the things we like to look at is, what if you replace that fuel source? What if you give them something that not only their body can utilize, but people with traumatic brain injury actually have enhanced transporters in their brain to take up and utilize ketones. It's almost as if their brain knows, I'm starving for energy, I can't use glucose, I need an alternative source of fuel. So what happens at that point?
Okay. So you're still using a lot of high carbohydrate diets to fuel performance for these guys?
Some guys, yes. Some of the guys that are early on, younger guys, I mean, they're still sticking on their traditional American diets. Some of the older vets that we're working with are starting to transition to I'd say like the modified Atkins approach. They're higher protein, moderate amount of fat, moderate to low carbohydrate, but still transitioning to try and get their bodies to utilize dual fuel.
Interesting. There's this recent article, I think on ESPN, that came out about James Harrison, plays for the Steelers. He's in his late 30s now, just a beast. And he says that he spends at least $300K a year on taking care of his body, whether that's like dry needling, cupping, massage, nutrition, trainers, everything. And he's a testament, like the guy doesn't get injured. And people at his position, so he's a pretty big defensive player. And so like you don't make it in your late 30s unless you're taking care of yourself. And so like he invests that much minimum per year is what he said. Like he's trying to get all his young people on the Steelers on this bandwagon, which I find fascinating.
That's huge. That's huge. And Tom Brady's the same way.
Yeah, he's obsessed, right?
Same way.
Just avoiding nightshades. I think he goes as far as like just removing everything like that. Yeah. So he's pretty deep into it. So this split between only getting benefits from nutritional ketosis versus exogenous ketones, there's almost this fear that I think people have. I get this question a lot as well. Is it dangerous to have carbohydrates and exogenous ketones at the same time? Like, or what's going to happen? Am I going to gain fat? So how would you think about this in terms of kind of like how it works in the body?
It's a great question. A lot of people ask that question is what happens when you have this dual fuel kind of concept? what we see and kind of my thought process on this is I think the brain and the heart do a very good job at taking up and utilize ketones no matter what, when they're present. I think even in the presence of carbohydrates, those two, the brain and the heart, will take them up and utilize them. One of the things that we know is that ketones themselves lower blood glucose levels. So if there's anything, ketones can actually potentially enhance insulin sensitivity. So I don't necessarily think there would be an adverse effect. And in fact, some of our colleagues, Dr. Richard Veach out of the UK and his partner Kieran Clark, they've done some research where they've given both carbohydrates and exogenous ketones at the same time and for performance. And what you see in that regard is preservation of muscle glycogen. So you preserve your muscle glycogen levels, and you're using these ketones as fuel very rapidly to power performance.
Did they look at tissue specificity to see kind of where the uptake of ketones versus glucose was?
They didn't. They didn't do a tracer to look at that. But when they took muscle biopsies, they found that glycogen levels were the same.
Interesting. Yeah. So, what is your kind of approach with people that you're working with? Do you administer exogenous ketones for some of these benefits while they're having a moderate to higher carb diet, or do you like to lean mostly towards a nutritional ketosis, or do you think that there's room for kind of a little bit of everything depending on the goal?
Exactly. I think it all depends on the goal. It always comes down to what's the outcome, and then how can we apply something. I mean, if someone's trying to lose weight or do something therapeutically, I always say let's address the root. Let's address the root first, which is diet. Let's get your diet in check, and then on top of that, we can start adding in exogenous ketones and various supplements.
Okay. So how do you bridge people and introduce them to a ketogenic diet, typically if they're coming from kind of a standard American?
Yeah, that's really good. So I think the first step is getting them to understand and teaching them to lower carbohydrate intake. A lot of people say, hey, let's just jump all in. And sometimes people get overwhelmed. They'll do it for like 1, 2, or 3 days, and then they're like, I feel horrible, I'm out. And it's like, well, let's kind of get you into this. Let's teach you how to eat right. And so let's go through it. So we educate very heavily on looking at nutritional labels and going, hey, let's understand that just because it's whole grain bread doesn't mean it's much different from the white bread. So bread's out. So it's like, oh, okay, now I get it. Or, hey, here's how many carbohydrates are in bananas. Because a lot of people go, oh, well, I can have fruit, right? I can have all this stuff on it. And so getting them to understand what foods have carbohydrates and sugar in them, lowering that, and then it's a lot easier transition into the ketogenic diet.
Okay. What do you think the biggest mistakes people are making on a ketogenic diet are?
First and foremost, I think a lot of people don't really tracking carbohydrate intake. I think they let it creep up too high. A lot of people are afraid. I'm not so worried about people eating higher amounts of protein. I think unless you come from like the bodybuilding fitness world, those are the type of people who are going to eat copious amounts of protein. But the other fact is people being afraid of fat still. People are still a little weary of, I don't know if I should have that. Like that might be too much. And it's like, it's okay. That's what you're utilizing as fuel. Eat it. And so those are the two things. Is some people, when they jump in, they'll go low carb, low fat, high protein, and they'll forget like, no, okay, let's keep the protein moderate, and you can use fat as fuel.
Interesting. What is your thought process around kind of the quality sources of fat and how people are approaching a ketogenic diet, how that's important?
Yeah, it's very important. The sources of fat matter, and I think teaching them a lot about foods that contain high amounts of MCTs. I'm a big fan of MCTs and how they can convert over to ketones very rapidly. But with that, people are still afraid of saturated fat. But actually, Dr. Jeff Volek's research showed that it's actually beneficial to have a combination of like monounsaturated fatty acids and saturated fats to get a high quality, like a well-formulated ketogenic diet.
So if people are looking for the high quality fats and ones that contain naturally high amounts of MCTs, where would you point them as far as actual food sources?
I mean, contrary to the American Heart Association, I'm a big fan of coconut oil.
It's crazy.
It's crazy, but huge fan of coconut oil. I like all different kinds of meat. Dairy is something that's interesting. Heavy creams high in MCTs, but what we find is that I'm not opposed to dairy, but people that tend to struggle after time on a ketogenic diet, I tend to say, hey, let's look at your dairy intake. Maybe you're eating too much cheese per day. So how can we maybe eliminate or cut back on some of that?
Right. What I've seen clinically is that dairy is a very individual thing. So some people have no problem with it, but other people, it just completely ruins their kind of nutritional profile and skyrockets their lipid panel, and like everything goes out of whack as soon as they start eating dairy. It's interesting. What are your thoughts on kind of a long-term ketogenic diet, 2, 3, 4 years? Is it something that people should be in long-term, in your opinion, or should people kind of just eat whatever's available to a certain extent? Like, what is your thought process there?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it earlier. I think it's about the ketogenic lifestyle, like, or at least a lower carb lifestyle. And I really think that people look at the word diet and think, oh, immediate, short term, cool, I'm going to diet for 3 weeks, get ready for shred for the wed, and then and then blow back out. And so it's like, well, no, this is a lifestyle. And I really think making it work for someone's life is what truly matters. That's where compliance comes into it. And so finding ways to not make it, hey, I need to be so strict, and you're out at a family function and you're like, no, I'm not going to eat anything. That's not making it a lifestyle. So
Right.
How do you make alternatives? How do you have a day where maybe you have a huge protein up and you hit the Brazilian steakhouse down the road, and that's completely fine? And making it work for people and letting them understand, just because you had a day where you had maybe a way more protein or you had a little bit more carbohydrates, it's not the end of the world.
Right. Yeah, more of the sustainability, I think, is the most important part.
Huge piece.
What do you say to the people who comment on things like hormone problems with a long-term ketogenic diet, gut problems? So I know there's like, as anything that becomes popular like this really quickly, there becomes a lot of resistance to change in any other kind of discipline. So I'm seeing now, as ketogenic diet has become kind of more aware in a lot of these health circles, that there's a lot of people kind of trying to bring it down. So what are your responses to that?
Yeah, I actually think we saw in our 12-week study that actually improved hormonal profiles. So I think as long as someone's keeping it in check, I don't think there would be any adverse effects. And so as far as gut health, there's so much to learn with long term. But if you actually think about it, one of the most powerful things for the gut is butyrate, right? Our gut makes butyrate itself, and it's actually a powerful thing for a ton of different things. Part of a ketogenic diet is the production of beta hydroxybutyrate, and so there's some thought there that if you're these ketones, beta hydroxybutyrate, you're getting an ample amount of butyrate, which can fuel and kind of help gut health. So yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and we definitely need more research in that area.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed about hormone production and problems with ketosis is not necessarily being on a ketogenic diet, but it's such an appetite regulation that some people eat so few calories and such little food that's what actually causes a lot of the hormonal problems, especially in women.
Interesting.
Yeah, so like the combination of not being comfortable with eating a ton of fat, and then also the satiating effects of a ketogenic diet, I think a lot of times leads to those, especially thyroid problems in women, is what I've seen.
Definitely. That makes complete sense.
And then as far as gut kind of microbiome, what we traditionally study as a well-populated microbiome is from people who have eating a lot of carbohydrates. And so if we're looking at a population that eats carbohydrates and compare it to someone who eats a ketogenic diet, of course it's going to be different, but that does not mean that it's wrong or bad.
Not at all.
So you just have different bacteria that thrive on metabolizing and eating fat, essentially, versus ones that thrive on carbohydrate.
Exactly.
And so I actually think it's way easier to keep things like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth down on a ketogenic diet, where this is where the kind of bacteria migrates from kind of deeper down in your gut in your large intestine to up towards where it shouldn't be in your small intestine. And that's because they eat sugars and things that are easily digestible. Whereas, even some of the carbs that people get on a ketogenic diet can be of soluble fiber, which then leads to things like butyrate and short chain fatty acids and stuff like that. So,
No, it's absolutely right.
So that's so ketogenic diet is obviously a huge focus of yours, and obviously you're blending it with performance. What are the types of things that are going into that now that you guys are kind of having aha moments on, that people maybe aren't applying on a day-to-day basis with either training or performance?
Yeah, so the first thing that was an aha moment for us was you can actually perform extremely well on a ketogenic diet. And we get a lot of heat for a lot of the research we do, but because we're showing things that a lot of people thought were never possible, but no one's ever studied them or explored them. And so we're willing to take that risk and go, hey, we want to look at a well-formulated ketogenic diet and see, can you perform? And now there's multiple studies coming out showing that performance can happen, and it can happen well on a ketogenic diet.
Interesting. What type of performance indicators are you looking at?
Everything from strength and power to like one of our colleagues who's here, Rachel Gregory, she did a study on CrossFit athletes. So they did a whole a workout a day, and found that both groups improved to the same extent. Those who were on a ketogenic diet, once they were fully adapted, were able to perform just as well as those who were eating a standard American carbohydrate-rich diet.
Interesting. Do you have anything that you've seen that isn't a good fit with ketosis or ketogenic diet?
Yeah, so one of the studies we did was on a cyclical ketogenic diet. Okay. So people who just were new to the diet, and Monday through Friday they went keto, Saturday and Sunday they went back to normal carbohydrate diet. And what we found was that after a while, they were actually starting to lose muscle mass, and they didn't lose really any fat mass. And part of that reason that we think is that if you look at, they were never truly keto adapted, and they were fluctuating on this roller coaster between hey, I have glucose present all the time, and then it was now I'm starting to get back into ketosis, and they were only ever quote unquote in ketosis Thursday and Friday, and then they'd go back and eat carbohydrates. So that roller coaster of extreme carbohydrate uptake and eating a lot of carbohydrates on the weekends doesn't seem to be a great fit for most people.
Mm-hmm. So you think getting into it and staying into it is much more impactful?
Yeah, and I think there's so much to learn on the cyclical kind of approach. We did a 2-day extreme carb up, and they weren't resistance training. Now, could that be completely different if you were to take someone and on their leg day, they had a carb up? Absolutely, it could be completely different, and they could be completely fine. So I think there's still a lot to learn. How targeted ketogenic diet comes into play. So can you get away with having more carbohydrates around your workout and just staying in a ketogenic for all 7 days of the week? That's a whole nother area to look at as well. So we're just learning and just starting a lot of this stuff, but it's fascinating.
So what have you looked at as far as hypertrophy and ketogenic diet? So building muscle tissue.
Yeah. So we in our 12-week study, we looked at DEXA-determined, which is the gold standard for looking at body composition, lean body mass. And what we found was that those who are on a ketogenic diet were able to gain just as much muscle and lose significantly more fat than those who are eating their regular diet that was filled with carbohydrates. So we see that once someone's adapted, they're able to gain just as much muscle and lose a little bit more fat.
This is one of the biggest things that people, I think, are clawing onto. It's impossible to build muscle on a ketogenic diet.
No.
Because you need carbohydrates to stimulate insulin and insulin storage mechanism into muscle tissues and this whole thing, right?
And so what we actually found, which is interesting, is ketones themselves can stimulate muscle protein synthesis. On top of that, if you look at beta-hydroxybutyrate with a primary ketone body, it actually spares the breakdown of leucine. And leucine is one of the most important amino acids for building and triggering muscle growth. So by sparing the breakdown of leucine, potentially you're extending that window even longer than someone who is on a standard American diet. So there's definitely potential for building muscle. It's just understanding those mechanisms.
So what is the mechanism behind ketones driving protein synthesis in muscle tissue?
It's a great question. I don't even think we know directly on how they're having that effect. If they're directly acting on mTOR or having some type of signaling effect, it could be that when given with a bolus of protein or branched chain amino acids, that rather than decreasing muscle protein synthesis over time, they're allowing leucine to do it for 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 hours, whereas with carbohydrates that might run out in 2 or 3.
Okay. So how do you take all this stuff that you've learned in the lab and apply it to kind of your day-to-day? So what does your day-to-day nutrition look like, for instance?
I play around with it all the time. I talk about it a lot, but the first time I did a ketogenic diet, I did it horribly. Like, it was the biggest fail I ever tried, because I was like, cool, I found this recipe for something called keto mousse. It was heavy cream, unsweetened dark chocolate, and protein powder. And I literally
Dom stuff.
yeah. Yep. And I literally just ate this like 5 times a day. And I was like, man, after 2 weeks, I was like, I feel horrible. Like, all I'm eating is heavy cream and protein, and this is terrible. But I play around with stuff all the time. Right now, I'm incorporating in a lot of intermittent fasting, and I'm playing around with intermittent fasting techniques of utilizing MCTs or utilizing exogenous ketones, and how I feel with each of those, and can I extend that intermittent fasting period longer by incorporating those in. So that's one of the things I just play around with, different things, test it on myself before we then go and test it on a ton of different subjects.
Okay. So what are the actual meals that you're eating look like as far as food sources?
Yeah. So I usually eat my first meal early afternoon, and I'm a huge salad guy. So I love Cobb salads. So usually every day for lunch, I usually hit a Cobb salad. 1, because it adds volume. 2, it adds a ton of fiber, and you can easily add fat sources in there, like bacon, eggs, blue cheese. And then at night, I'll have something like a good meat source, whether it's beef or steak, sometimes chicken that I'll fatten up, and vegetables. I'm pretty plain Jane. But then on the weekend, I'll go out and get something to eat with friends or family. Like, I have no qualms about eating out. It's just making the right decision.
Yeah, it's actually way easier to modify meals than people think. Like, people are like, well, I can't eat out anymore. I mean, I eat out all the time. I'm traveling so much, and I have visitors, and San Francisco is an awesome food city, and so like, I have no problem anywhere I go keeping it super low carb.
And I actually think it's easier to eat out ketogenic than it is like what people consider low fat, because with low fat, it's like, oh, can I have vegetables? Well, it's like, well, those vegetables are probably cooked in butter or some type of oil. Right. So did you ask them to spray it rather than? So it's so easy to just go, hey, I just want a meat source, a side salad, no croutons, and some type of vegetables.
Right.
Cool.
What I've recognized is that carbohydrates are like a fat delivery system typically, or like that's where the flavor, like it's just something to eat the actual thing you want on. So like if it's pasta, what you really want is a sauce and the meat. If it's like a taco, you really want the meat inside and the vegetables inside, right?
Exactly.
If it's like a piece of bread, you don't want the bread, you want the stuff in between the bread. It's like, why not just eat that?
Exactly. And the more and more, it's amazing, because there's actually a ton of companies coming out in this space that are realizing, all right, well, if we're really going to make this mainstream, we gotta find things that make it sustainable for people to eat all the time. Like, there are bread companies that are coming out that are making ketogenic friendly breads, and it's amazing to see that kind of progress moving forward. Because like getting someone like my mom or my dad on it, she's gonna be like, well, I love my grilled cheese. Well, it's like, well, I can go without grilled cheese, but if you really want grilled cheese, here's an alternative.
Right. Yeah, making it easy, I think, and more accessible is huge to have this actually catch on. So
absolutely.
What are the things for training that you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
I usually keep resistance. I usually resistance train 5 to 6 days a week. Keep it no more than 45 minutes. Compound movements, things like squats, overhead press. Right now, I don't do anything heavy. My knees just can't handle it from playing sports anymore. Right. I just don't see a huge need for it for me right now. So I stick in that 12 to sometimes I'll go up to like 20 rep range, do multiple sets, high intensity, and then I'll do a lot of high intensity interval like sprints. We do a lot of sprinting. Yeah,
I removed heavy lifting like a year ago, and I haven't felt better since, man. It's just day-to-day recovery is just so much easier, and I don't feel like I just need to sleep and eat a giant meal after every single workout. Oh my God, it's so much better.
It's great.
So what about sleep? Get a lot of sleep?
I'm trying, getting better. My brain's always going, and just with a lot of projects going on, I tend to work well really late at night and super early in the morning. Those are like prime time hours for me. But the one thing I have noticed is I've optimized my sleep, not just in the duration, but in the quality of doing things like I got blackout curtains. I keep my room super cold. I have the blue light blocking glasses. Like, I'm doing everything to make sure, all right, if I'm not getting at least the quantity of hours that I want. Like, I'm going to try and get the best quality, and that's one of the things I'm striving for.
Okay. What about like stress management techniques? Anything that you like? Obviously, you have a lot of stuff going on, even though it's all positive. Like, are you doing anything to kind of take a step back and keep that too low?
Yeah. So I use an app called Headspace.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Big Headspace fan, and in the middle of the day, I'll do some type of like meditation. It's been tremendous for me. Like literally in the morning, I'll do a daily journal. It's something called the 5-minute journal.
Yep.
And it's like daily affirmations for the day, like kind of getting you started on the right foot. And I love that. And then in the middle of the day, some quick meditation. It's just been a game changer for me.
Awesome. So what do you notice as far as meditation impacting you?
You know, overall, it's just not only my productivity, but just like the attitude that I approach things with the second half of the day. Because it's one thing when you go into the office or you're working and you crank very early on in the day, and then a lot of people just tend to dwindle down. It's hard to keep that same pace all day. And so breaking that up with, I'll usually go on a walk because our facility is right on the beach, so it's nice to get out on there, get some sun, get on a walk, and then I'll go in and do some meditation. It completely just opens up my mind, gets me a lot more creative and thinking differently, and gets me in a good spot for the second half of the day.
Yeah, I've noticed it's very cumulative. So like if I will meditate one day, it's whatever. But then if it's like 3 weeks in a row, 4 weeks in a row, it's a huge game changer.
Absolutely.
Huge thing that I think a lot of people aren't focusing on in their health.
Definitely. It really is. And I think, like you talked about, stress management, when people talk about, oh, well, I'm having trouble losing weight, or I'm having trouble in my life, like that's one of the biggest pieces. Nutrition's great, sleep's very, very important, but managing stress is something that everyone can do.
Right.
And it can take the whole I don't have time thing. Like, anyone can find 15 to 30 minutes in their day to manage some stress, decompress, and really put you in a whole different kind of state.
So what's this quote have you heard this, where it says, if you don't have time to meditate for 15 minutes a day, you should be meditating for an hour a day?
That's great. I love that. That's awesome.
Yeah, such an easy thing to add in. So you guys have taken a lot of this information and you cooked up a little book here, huh?
We did. So about a year ago, it's when it all started. And so what started, it's really a passion project for Dr. Wilson and I. We wrote the book, The Ketogenic Bible. It's coming out August 15th officially for launch, but truly a passion project for taking everything from the history of where did this all start, like back in the 1800s with William Banting, like where to where we are now with exogenous ketones. Like, how did we get here? And then what is a ketogenic diet? And then all different types of applications, from Alzheimer's to cancer to Parkinson's, traumatic brain injury, and how can we use that and then practically apply it?
Right. Yeah. So I think I mentioned to you before we started, but I got this review copy right before I came down to San Diego, and it is enormous.
Yeah.
Like, it's like a college level textbook size. I was like, holy crap! Like, what? And I started paging through it. Like, not only is it like the information is super awesome and super helpful, but you guys have all these little diagrams and things that I think that make the content so much more digestible. It's like conferences like we're at right now are good, but if you're trying to take information as just an average person who wants to make change in their health, this is not a place for you to be. Like, reading abstract papers and like hearing all this dry information being spoken to you. Like, you guys make it very approachable and so action based. So
Thanks,
awesome job
man.
on that. Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
What in the book were the kind of the main things that you guys broke down that you thought were super important to include?
You know, first off, I think just getting people to understand what is ketosis and what is a ketogenic diet. I feel because it's gotten so popular, there's so many different definitions of what this is, and people that are fearful of one thing and not another. So we basically just tried to put a big stance on that and go, hey, here's everything that we know. We're not the experts on it. We're fortunate to have a ton of colleagues and amazing people around us who helped support and put the passion behind this idea. Perfect example is the cancer section. Our really good friend, Dr. Dom D'Agostino and Dr. Angela Poff, are two of the leading people in the world studying this stuff. And so we ran a ton of ideas and had them read over the chapter before we submitted it. And just having that access and having that ability to tap into all these people who are doing incredible work and breaking it down in an understandable manner. So hopefully someone somewhere someday can get access to this and go, wow, that's made an impact in my life. My life's changed because I've read that, I understand it, and I applied it.
It's amazing. So what do you personally go to learn about this type of stuff? Are you looking at papers? Are you reading books, podcasts? Are you chatting with people? Are you going to conferences? Like where are your main kind of sources of information?
Yeah, so I mean, constantly reading papers. I every morning I probably read at least 2 to 3 brand new ones. I'm signed up for alerts to get what's latest on ketosis or ketogenic diets. That's one. Conferences are incredible because you get to see and hang out with great people like you and hear from leading minds in the industry of what's new, what's novel, what are their thought processes, and getting that access to them can save years of studying and trying to read papers and decipher it on your own. But just talking to someone like a Dom at a conference and saying, hey, what's the latest stuff that you're working on? It's mind-blowing to figure out what are they working on, what are they doing, and then getting that information and being able to disseminate it to other people is what it's all about.
Yeah, one of the things that I appreciate a lot about the ketogenic diet community versus kind of like the paleo community that has come and is almost tapering off at this point is that the focus on the evidence and the science is so much more in depth and foundational than a paleo diet was more kind of an ideology, if you want to call it that, where the ketogenic diet is such a measurable state of metabolism that people are really focusing on all these different parameters, how it actually affects the body, which I think is super fascinating.
It's brilliant. And this community itself is so supportive of one another. It's amazing to see how we cross over in so many different ways, but there's people that are supporting each other in cancer and Alzheimer's and performance, and it's like everyone's there to support each other and just trying to figure out, okay, how can we help? How can we get this message out to the world? Right. So it's incredible.
I'm sure we could chat forever, but we should probably get back inside here. Yeah. So where can people find you that if they want to know more information, and kind of where can they find the book that you're launching here?
Yeah. So I mean, Facebook, Ryan Lowery. On Instagram, it's Ryan P. Lowery, Lowery. And then our book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and then hopefully a bunch of different bookstores around you. So
awesome. Well, thanks again. Appreciate it. We'll chat soon, buddy.
Definitely.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.